The day jets entered the sky, air combat stopped being fair. One moment, propeller fighters ruled the air, twisting and turning in brutal dogfights where skill meant everything. The next moment, pilots were dying without ever seeing who killed them. Imagine climbing through cold blue sky in a World War II aeroprop fighter, engine roaring, hands tight on the stick, then a silver blur slices past at impossible speed. No warning, no dogfight, just a flash and a funeral notice. That blur was a jet, and it rewrote the rules in real time. Prop pilots were trained to hunt. Jets turned them into prey. These weren't experimental test flights or clean handovers of technology. This was a violent transition, fought in real wars by real men who had no choice but to adapt or die. Veterans who survived flak, Messerschmitts, and Zeros suddenly found themselves outpaced, outclimbed, and outgunned by machines that didn't even belong to their generation. The sky became a slaughterhouse of speed, where experience meant less than velocity and tradition got pilots killed. This was the most ruthless era in air combat history, the moment when propellers fought jets, and the future showed up looking for blood. When World War II ended, the world thought air combat had reached its final form. Propeller fighters had carried nations to victory, and the pilots who flew them were treated like untouchable legends. Aircraft like the P-51 Mustang, the Spitfire, the FW-190, and the Zero weren't just machines. They were proven killers, refined through years of brutal trial by fire. But while victory parades rolled through city streets, a quieter revolution was already warming up on the runways. Jet engines, once risky science projects, were suddenly real, and they didn't care about tradition. Air forces rushed to adopt them, not fully understanding what they were unleashing. This created a dangerous overlap, a gray zone where propeller aircraft and jet fighters were forced to share the same sky, the same missions, and sometimes the same enemies. The problem wasn't just technology, it was doctrine. Pilots were still being trained using World War II playbooks built around turning fights, close-range gunnery, and visual tracking. Jets ignored those rules. Speed replaced finesse. Altitude replaced angles. Surprise replaced skill. Early jet pilots weren't taught how to dogfight because jets weren't meant to dogfight. They were interceptors, designed to strike fast and disappear. Meanwhile, prop pilots were expected to fly as if nothing had changed, even when everything had. That disconnect turned combat into chaos. Training manuals lagged behind reality, and instructors were often learning alongside their students. The sky became a classroom where failure meant death. Nowhere was this collision more violent than in the early Cold War battlefields, especially Korea. American forces flew a mixed lineup, jet fighters screaming at high altitude, while prop-driven Mustangs and Corsairs flew low, attacking ground targets. On paper, jets owned the sky. In reality, the situation was messy. Enter the Soviet-built MiG-15. Fast, heavily armed, and deadly at altitude, it dominated any straight fight against prop aircraft. Mustang pilots knew the truth the moment they saw one climb past them like they were standing still. There was no chasing a jet. There was no catching up. If a MiG wanted to engage, it chose the moment. If it wanted to leave, it was gone. But commanders still sent prop pilots into contested airspace because there weren't enough jets, and early jets couldn't stay airborne long. That decision put experienced veterans and young rookies alike into impossible situations. These men weren't reckless. They were trapped by logistics and timing. Jets were still unreliable. Engines. Maintenance crews worked non-stop just to keep aircraft operational. So props kept flying, absorbing punishment meant for machines already being phased out. This era wasn't a clean transition. It was a violent overlap where old war heroes flew outdated aircraft against threats they were never meant to face. Pride, habit, and necessity collided in the sky. Every mission felt like borrowed time. The jet age wasn't announced. It ambushed the propeller generation, and the setup for one of aviation history's harshest lessons was complete. The first real encounters between propeller fighters and jets felt unreal, like two different centuries crashing into each other at closing speeds nobody was ready for. Prop pilots would spot something moving too fast to track, a silver streak cutting across the sky, and by the time their brains processed what they'd seen, the fight was already over. Jets didn't circle. They didn't turn and burn. They attacked in slashing passes, diving from altitude, firing a short burst, and vanishing before a prop fighter could even line up a shot. For pilots raised on World War II dogfighting doctrine, this wasn't air combat. It felt like an execution. Confusion ruled the sky. Radios crackled with panicked calls as pilots tried to warn each other about threats that had already passed. Visual spotting, once the backbone of survival, became unreliable. A jet could be invisible until it was deadly close, and the sound arrived too late to matter. Prop pilots tried everything they knew. They tightened turns, dove for speed, hugged the terrain, anything to drag the fight into a place where jets lost their advantage. Sometimes it worked. A jet pilot who stayed too long, who bled off energy in a low-altitude chase, could suddenly find himself slow, heavy, and vulnerable. Those moments were rare, but when they happened, they proved something important. The prop wasn't useless, just outmatched. Meanwhile, jet pilots weren't gods. Early jets were brutal machines to fly. Throttle response was slow, engines were fragile, and a single mistake could turn speed into disaster. Pilots had seconds to fire their guns before fuel limits forced them to disengage. Ammunition was limited, and recoil from heavy cannons could throw off aim at high speed. Jet pilots learned quickly that one missed pass might be their only chance. They lived under constant pressure to make every second count. There was no room for hesitation, no safety net. As encounters increased, both sides began adapting in real time. Prop pilots stopped chasing jets they couldn't catch and started anticipating where they would strike. They flew unpredictable patterns, used cloud cover aggressively, and relied on teamwork more than ever. Survival depended on discipline. Lone wolves didn't last long. Jets, on the other hand, refined hit-and-run tactics, learning when to engage and when to disengage before the fight turned ugly. Every encounter became a live experiment, and the lessons were paid for in wreckage. The emotional weight of this phase was crushing. Imagine climbing into a cockpit knowing the enemy had a technological edge you couldn't overcome, only mitigate. That knowledge sat heavy in every prop pilot's gut. They flew anyway, not because they were fearless, but because the mission didn't care how fair the fight was. Some of these men had survived the entire Second World War, only to face a more lethal threat in its aftermath. Experience kept them alive longer than expected, but it didn't guarantee survival. Slowly, painfully, the shape of modern air combat began to form. Speed became king. Energy management replaced turn radius. Surprise became the deadliest weapon in the sky. The buildup of this era wasn't about dramatic victories. It was about constant adaptation under fire. Every sortie pushed the boundary between old and new, and every loss carved the future a little deeper. The sky was changing, and anyone who couldn't change with it was being left behind at 30,000 feet. The confrontation phase was where illusion died. By this point, no one in the sky believed propeller fighters could truly compete with jets anymore, but combat kept forcing them into the same airspace anyway. This wasn't a clash of equals, it was a stress test, and the sky showed no mercy. Jet fighters now controlled altitude and timing. They decided when a fight happened and when it ended. For prop pilots, every mission felt like walking into an ambush that hadn't sprung yet. You knew it was coming. You just didn't know from where. Closing speeds were insane by the standards of the time. A jet diving on a prop could erase the distance between them in seconds. There was no room for correction, no time to recover from a mistake. One misjudged turn, one delayed reaction, and the fight was over. Jet cannons tore through prop airframes like they were made of tin. Fuel tanks ignited. Control surfaces vanished. Pilots didn't always get a mayday call out. Many never saw the aircraft that killed them. Death came from above, behind, and faster than human reflexes could handle. For the prop pilots who fought back, confrontation meant committing to fights they couldn't win on paper. Head-on passes became desperate gambles. You aimed straight at an oncoming jet, knowing whoever fired first would probably survive. There was no honor in it, just survival math. Even then, the jet usually had the edge, more speed, more firepower, more escape options. But those moments defined the era. Men chose to fight anyway, because breaking off sometimes meant dying from behind. Jet pilots, meanwhile, faced their own brutal reality. Speed didn't make them untouchable. One bad decision could erase every advantage. Jets that stayed too long in a fight bled energy fast, especially at low altitude. If a jet slowed down, it stopped being a predator and started becoming a target. Prop pilots learned to exploit that window with ruthless focus. A jet caught slow was a jet in danger. Those rare reversals became legendary, not because they were common, but because they proved the fight wasn't entirely one-sided. The confrontation also played out beyond individual dogfights. Entire squadrons had to rethink how they operated. Prop units flew tighter formations, depended heavily on mutual cover, and coordinated constantly with ground control. Jets operated higher, faster, and more independently. The sky split into layers, each one deadly in its own way. When those layers overlapped, chaos followed. Missed communications, radar gaps, and weather turned carefully planned missions into sudden close-range fights neither side wanted. What made this phase especially brutal was its inevitability. Everyone involved knew the outcome. Jets were the future. Prop fighters were on borrowed time. Yet the war didn't pause for upgrades. Pilots flew what they had. Commanders sent them because they had no alternatives. The confrontation wasn't about proving which aircraft was better. That was already clear. It was about surviving long enough to reach the next era. By the end of this phase, the message was unmistakable. Air combat had crossed a line it couldn't uncross. The sky no longer rewarded patience or turning skill. It rewarded speed, timing, and aggression. The propeller era wasn't defeated in one battle. It was ground down, mission by mission, until even its bravest pilots knew the truth. The age of jets hadn't arrived gently. It forced its way in, and the confrontation proved that nothing in the air would ever be the same again. Here's the twist most history books gloss over. The jet age didn't instantly make air combat safer or pilots smarter. In many ways, it made everything deadlier. When jets replaced prop fighters, accident rates spiked hard. Pilots who had mastered prop aircraft suddenly found themselves flying machines that punished hesitation and magnified mistakes. Throttle lag, compressor stalls, flameouts. These weren't rare problems, they were daily threats. Many pilots never saw combat at all because the jet killed them first. The future arrived unfinished, and it demanded bodies to refine it. Prop pilots, often written off as obsolete, were actually carrying the transition on their backs. They weren't just flying outdated aircraft, they were buying time. While jets struggled with range, reliability, and maintenance, prop fighters kept wars moving forward. Ground attack missions, close air support, convoy protection. These roles stayed alive because prop aircraft could loiter, absorb damage, and operate from rough airstrips jets couldn't handle yet. The irony was brutal. The so-called outdated machines were often more survivable in certain missions than the cutting-edge jets replacing them. Another uncomfortable truth was that early jet combat wasn't elegant. It was rushed, inefficient, and often indecisive. High-speed passes led to missed shots, brief engagements, and pilots burning fuel without results. Jet pilots had seconds to identify, aim, and fire. Miss that window, and the fight was over. This forced a mentality shift that took years to stabilize. Early jet victories weren't always about skill. They were about opportunity. Being in the right place at the right altitude mattered more than being the better pilot. And here's the real twist. Many of the lessons that saved jet pilots came from prop veterans. Energy management, formation discipline, situational awareness. These weren't invented by jets. They were inherited. Prop pilots understood patience. They understood restraint. They knew when not to fight. Those instincts transferred directly into jet combat once speed stopped being treated as invincibility. Jet pilots who ignored those lessons died just as fast as prop pilots who ignored speed. There was also a shift in respect that didn't show up in official reports. Jet pilots quietly admired prop veterans who flew knowing they were outmatched. That kind of courage wasn't about bravado, it was about duty. These men climbed into cockpits fully aware the odds were stacked against them. They weren't chasing glory. They were holding the line while the future caught up. By the mid-transition era, something unexpected happened. The line between prop and jet philosophy blurred. Jets slowed down to survive. Pilots learned to disengage instead of chase kills. Air combat became less about the duel and more about control of space and time. The romantic image of dogfighting faded, replaced by calculated violence. This wasn't the death of skill, it was its evolution. The twist of this era is simple but uncomfortable. Progress didn't arrive clean. It arrived hungry. Jets didn't just replace propellers. They consumed an entire generation of pilots to become what they are today. The propeller era didn't fail. It was sacrificed. And the modern sky is built on that sacrifice, whether history likes to admit it or not. The final lesson of the propeller-to-jet transition isn't written in speed records or kill ratios. It's written in the quiet understanding that progress always costs more than anyone plans for. The men who flew during this era weren't just pilots caught between technologies. They were human shock absorbers for history. They took the impact so the next generation wouldn't have to. The sky didn't slow down for them. It didn't wait for training manuals to catch up or for engines to become reliable. It demanded adaptation on the spot, and it punished hesitation without mercy. What makes this era so important isn't who won the air battles. It's how the definition of survival changed. In the prop era, mastery meant control, patience, and close-quarters skill. In the jet era, mastery meant restraint, timing, and knowing when not to engage. That shift didn't come naturally. It had to be learned the hard way. Pilots who tried to fly jets like prop fighters didn't last long. Pilots who treated speed as invincibility didn't either. The survivors were the ones who respected the machine without trusting it completely. There's a hard truth here that applies far beyond aviation. Technology will always outrun doctrine. Machines will evolve faster than human thinking, and the gap between the two is where people get hurt. The transition era proves that being experienced doesn't guarantee safety, and being advanced doesn't guarantee superiority. What matters is adaptation. The pilots who lived long enough to pass on their lessons understood this better than anyone. They stopped chasing the past and stopped worshiping the future. They learned to work inside reality as it was, not as it used to be. The prop pilots who faced jets weren't on the wrong side of history. They were standing in front of it. Their aircraft may have been outdated, but their courage wasn't. Flying into combat knowing you're outmatched isn't ignorance, it's commitment. Those missions kept wars moving, bought time for technology to mature, and shaped how air combat would be fought for decades to come. Every modern pilot benefits from lessons written by men who never got to see the finished product. Today's skies are cleaner, faster, and safer, but they're also colder. Air combat is measured in radar returns and missile envelopes instead of eye contact and turning circles. That evolution came from pain. It came from trial and error carried out at lethal speed. Remembering the transition era matters because it reminds us that progress isn't gentle. It's sharp. It cuts first and explains itself later. So when a jet roars overhead, don't just see the machine. See the lineage. See the prop pilots who heard that sound for the first time and didn't know what it meant, only that it was coming for them. This is Xtreme USA, where real war history gets told straight. If you respect the cost of progress, make sure to subscribe, like, comment, and share, because these stories were paid for in blood, and they deserve to be remembered.